If you type superpower country into an internet search box, the first result will generally be the United States, a nation dominating the world stage. Did you know that nearly a quarter of the world's total GDP currently comes from the United States? It is no wonder that the US dollar dominates the global market, not to mention its respected military might, which is even considered a benchmark for modern military power. But what makes it so special? How could a country that is relatively young rise so quickly to the top of the power chain and become the center of global affairs? The answer is not simple. The United States has a long and complex history, and this time we will break it down piece by piece to understand what really shaped this superpower. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller created a world map that included the word America, referring to the continent in the west. The name was taken from an Italian explorer and cartographer, Amerigo Vespucci. In fact, the original inhabitants of the American lands migrated from Asia between about 40,000 and 12,000 years ago. They built colonies, developed advanced agricultural techniques, designed impressive architecture, and even created civilizations comparable to states, as seen in the pre-Columbian Mississippian culture. Unfortunately, after European explorers and traders made first contact with the native peoples of America, millions of them died from diseases brought by the Europeans, one of which was smallpox. Spanish explorers later landed in Florida in 1513 and established settlements in California and New Mexico. They then joined forces with the British colonists on the American continent. It was the British settlements, which began in 1607 when many British ships landed on the coast of Virginia, that later became a key factor in the formation of the United States. The British established much larger colonies, founding settlements, gradually clearing forests, and claiming the land as their own. The Dutch did not want to be left behind either, establishing New Netherland in what is now known as New York. However, British ambition was much greater than the Dutch, and one by one British colonies began to emerge along the eastern coast from Massachusetts to Georgia. In each new colony, the same pattern occurred over and over. They exploited natural resources, forcibly removed the indigenous people from their lands, and enslaved millions of Africans brought to the continent. Over time, the inhabitants of these colonies, subject to British rule, began to show signs of resistance because they felt oppressed by the policies of the British government. These colonists were seeking a new life, but moving continents still meant they were forced to pay high taxes to the British government, even though they had no representation in the British Parliament. This spirit of rebellion and the desire for freedom grew even stronger, especially with the influence of great thinkers such as John Locke and Thomas Paine, who supported the uprising. At its peak, on July 4, 1776, the founders of the United States finally declared their independence by adopting the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson. A long and exhausting civil war ended, and a new nation was born from a great revolution, although its birth was far from perfect. The early records of the United States include a dark stain in the form of slavery. In addition to the grim history of slavery, it should be noted that as a new nation, the U.S. had a similar goal to its colonial rulers, to expand its sovereignty. It is not surprising, therefore, that the U.S. government held a belief akin to manifest destiny, a conviction that God had blessed the U.S. and destined it to control the entire American continent and increase its power. This idea was strongly embedded in the 19th century as a campaign to expand the territory by expelling Native Americans, a campaign that also served as a pretext for the U.S. to seize the natural resources of lands belonging to Native peoples. The expansion of U.S. sovereignty did not stop there. It eventually led to the seizure of territories from other countries, such as Mexico. Mexico had actually gained its independence from Spain in 1810 and was granted a very large territory. Historical texts reveal that U.S. settlements grew rapidly in northern Mexico, with the number of English speakers surpassing those who spoke Spanish. This situation eventually sparked a rebellion by American settlers in northern Mexico, as seen in Texas in 1835. The Texas Rebellion led the region to gain full independence from Mexico, and 10 years later, the Republic of Texas voluntarily joined the United States. Later, when the U.S. was led by its 11th president, James K. Polk, who sought a clear border with Mexico, California was also claimed by the U.S., leading to the war between Mexico and the U.S. in the mid-19th century. At its peak, the war resulted in the U.S. invading Mexico City, and the United States won, seizing about one-third of Mexico's territory. Thanks to that war, U.S. territory then stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, a critical step for the U.S. to build the foundation of its economy, since the Pacific coastal area was a densely used international trade route to Pacific and East Asian countries. Although the United States initially practiced isolationism, its connection to the Atlantic coast, combined with the development of railroads, matured the nation's territory enough to turn the U.S. into a major power, especially during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Gradually, the young nation shifted from an agriculture-based economy to a producer of manufactured goods. The United States even managed to produce its own famous firearms, rivaling German arms industries. The Industrial Revolution and advancements in technology spurred the country to become self-sufficient and advanced far more quickly than its competitors. This industrial and technological progress, especially in production, allowed many American entrepreneurs to expand their operations abroad. With a booming economy and increasingly intense interaction with other nations, new challenges arose for the fledgling nation. In 1898, for example, a Spanish-flagged ship sank the USS Maine, a U.S. warship in Cuba, sparking a war between Spain and the United States, which continued with a trade conflict between the U.S. and Europe from 1899 until 1934, known as the Banana Wars. Soon after, a pretext emerged for conquering Spain, and the U.S. took over Spanish territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, followed by the annexation of Hawaii, Samoa, and several other areas. This sequence of events quickly put the United States in the spotlight of global affairs. When World War I broke out, the United States became increasingly involved in world politics. Its name began to be considered by other nations as a potential ally. The U.S. then shifted its total isolationist policy under President Woodrow Wilson, who helped form the League of Nations to prevent another world war, although his efforts failed as World War II eventually occurred, devastating European economies. But who would have thought that this would be an opportunity for the United States to rise as a superpower at a time when many of Europe's great powers were crumbling? The U.S. was fortunate because its geographic location was an advantage. Being isolated from major conflicts in Europe allowed the U.S. to remain relatively safe and focus on internal development, economically, infrastructurally, and militarily. In addition, the abundance of natural resources in the American continent, vast fertile lands, extensive forests, and large mineral deposits, became a super strong foundation for its economic growth and government development. The United States also adopted policies that were friendly to former Spanish colonies for economic reasons, which significantly boosted its revenue. Over time, U.S. power and influence grew not only through its economy and military, but also as an architect of the global political and economic system. A distinctive trait of this nation is its frequent intervention in other countries' affairs, a trait that has affected world stability. For example, the U.S. once took part in the barbaric wars that lasted 15 years from 1801 to 1815. During this period, the U.S. allied with Sweden and Sicily against Morocco and the Ottoman Empire in North Africa to secure safe passage for its trading ships. Later, for trade interests, President Millard Fillmore sent Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry on a diplomatic expedition, known as the Perry Expedition, between 1853 and 1854. Perry led U.S. naval warships to pressure Japan into ending its 220-year isolation, opening its ports to American trade and negotiating trade agreements. Although Japan had closed itself off since the 17th century to guard its sovereignty against widespread European colonialism, Perry's relentless pressure forced Japan to reopen to the world, which greatly benefited the US by allowing it to spread its influence in Asia and the Pacific. Previously, the United States had also intervened to help Spanish colonies seeking independence, so its victory over Spain eventually propelled the US as a global power, breaking down the old European power structures. The US truly gained recognition only after its involvement in World War I and World War II, and by surviving the economic devastation that followed the wars. World War I destroyed the economies of major countries and brought down great empires such as the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese dynasty. But the US emerged largely unscathed because of its geographic separation from these conflicts. Similarly, when World War II broke out, the US ended up even more advantaged. The enormous war brought down Germany, the Soviet Union, and China, leaving many nations with ruined infrastructures. In response, under the guidance of George Marshall, the US initiated the Marshall Plan, a program offering economic assistance to rebuild European nations. This aid, amounting to $13 billion at the time, was not only meant to rebuild the economies of Western and Southern Europe, or simply create stability, but also to prevent the spread of communism and to strengthen US influence in the Western Bloc. Although the Marshall Plan is seen as a major humanitarian effort, it also made Western and Southern European countries heavily dependent on the United States. At the same time, the US faced formidable competitors like the Soviet Union. They engaged in a Cold War, a conflict fought not by direct military confrontation but by competing for global influence. This included supporting coups, backing dictatorial regimes, and engaging in proxy wars around the world. The Cold War intensified as both sides built alliances, military bases, and raced to develop highly advanced technology, even venturing into space. This Cold War finally ended when the Soviet Union collapsed on December 25, 1991, marking the moment when the US emerged as the sole superpower in world history. The United States has built an unparalleled global power structure because it developed a deeply rooted system from the very beginning by creating international organizations such as the United Nations Security Council. It also initiated the international financial system, establishing institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. In terms of defense, the US wields enormous power, especially when considering its membership in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which includes European countries and Turkey. However, this situation began to change somewhat when Donald Trump took office with his America First policy, which tended to turn inward and opened opportunities for other nations like China and Russia to expand their influence in an attempt to replace the United States as the dominant superpower. While the main competitors for the US are considered to be China and Russia, some political observers believe that the US will remain the sole superpower for several more decades, even as its rivals intensify their influence. This does not mean, however, that America will never face decline or lose its superpower status, especially given the persistent domestic political divisions and corruption. Overall, though, America is said to be more likely to grow and sustain itself. This opinion was also expressed by Professor Michael Beckley, a political science expert, who published a book titled Unriffle: Why America Will Remain the World's Sole Superpower. When comparing the US to China, Michael noted that although American institutions might be seen as chaotic, China's system is even worse, being controlled by an oligarchy under a lifelong dictator. According to Michael, if the US is considered a flawed democracy, then China is no better due to its authoritarian rule. In his published interview in Tufts Now, Michael stated that China is the only nation that comes close to matching the power and advantages of the United States when measured by national strength. However, China still cannot compete because American wealth is nearly 3 times greater than China's, and its military might is even 5 times stronger. This gap cannot be closed quickly. It would take decades for the two countries to become equal. Even if conditions in the United States deteriorate, with a host of problems and internal issues, the long-term economic prospects for America are still seen as the best compared to other countries, making it unlikely that the US will fall into a deep decline. So how does Russia compare in terms of technological military power and weaponry? According to Michael, although Russia is a successor state of the former Soviet Union and was once a major rival to the United States, it still cannot compete in terms of overall strength. One reason is that Russia's military budget is 10 times smaller than that of the US, and its economy is not as large. Some even say it is smaller than the state of Texas. Furthermore, Michael noted that Russia lacks any allies capable of matching the US, which is strongly backed by NATO, the strongest alliance in history. Some sources have suggested that China and Russia might unite against the US, but this seems almost impossible. They even share a 2,600-mile border and continue to compete for influence throughout Eurasia, even selling arms to each other's adversaries. Michael mentioned in his interview that although China and Russia's alliance is not solid, it should still be watched closely, as both are engaged in actions aimed at toppling the US and replacing it as the sole superpower. The United States enjoys privileges that other countries do not have. Not only can it freely set the global agenda, but it can also wage war in any part of the world without worrying about the security of its own territory. Its citizens can sleep peacefully without the constant threat of war on their doorstep. Moreover, the US seems free to make mistakes, even when involved in the most controversial wars or triggering global economic crises. It remains strong as the world's most powerful nation. The United States can also determine its foreign policy independently, without being bound by the interests of other countries. It can choose whether or not to engage in any conflict, while other nations are forced to deal with their own local issues. American citizens also enjoy the benefits of living in a superpower. They can travel almost anywhere with ease, using their own language and currency. In fact, many countries have adopted US laws and regulations, further cementing its position as the center of the global economy. The US continues to attract investments from around the world, as countries compete to forge good relations with America in order to access its markets and technologies. As a result, the United States lives in a wealth of resources and continues to attract the best talent from around the globe to advance its nation. However, this position of supremacy does come with consequences. The power of the United States can be misused. Its foreign policies often spark conflicts and instability in various parts of the world. While these impacts might not be felt by Americans at all, the smaller nations often bear the brunt of decisions made by this superpower.